Good morning. Good morning. So today we are going to be talking about our last situational approach to leadership. So again, to recap, and hopefully, I haven't for this section, I haven't been drawing my mind map. Hopefully by this point, y'all have kind of like picked up your own way of continuing your own mind map from what we did with trait and behavior theories and power and motivation. And so just to recap, if you want to think about, okay, what have we done since your last exam? We have pretty much focused on these situational approaches to leadership. We said that trait theory tells us who a leader is. Behavior theory told us what a leader does. But situational approaches were all focused on this idea of how leaders act. And so we started to take some more things into consideration. We're shifting from being very follower-centered to being more, did I say follower? From being leader-centered to being more follower-centered. And how we've tried to do that so far is that first we talked about LMX. Someone remind me what LMX was all about. Leader member exchange. And so it's this idea about dyadic relationships, one-on-one relationships between a leader and their follower, and about high quality or low quality relationships. And what does the quality of relationship result in? What's the outcome that we see from LMX? What happens to people or followers? We talked about how maybe on sports teams you can see this. What do we call those? The in and the out groups. And so based on the quality of relationship, we see that people either feel a part of the in group or they feel a part of the out group. So then after LMX, we started talking about the situational leadership model. What did this model tell us? What was like the thing that it considered beyond just the leader? It was a matching theory. And so what were we matching with situational leadership model?
Types of followers to leaders.
Types of followers to leaders. A little bit more specifically, we were looking at follower readiness level. So how competent they were, how committed they were. And then based off of what we knew about followers, we could assign a style. And again, that style went all the way back to task and relationship. It was, whether it was directing or very relational. But we would say leaders should match their style based on followers' readiness. Then we talked about path-goal theory. And path-goal theory was another kind of matching theory. It had some styles, but what's like really the big thing y'all need to remember about path-goal theory? Is a little thing that makes it unique.
Starts to consider the situation.
It actually starts to consider the situation. Absolutely. And so that was one of the weird things about situational leadership model. It's called situational leadership, but it actually doesn't look at the situation. It just looks at the follower readiness level. Path goal theory kind of starts to consider the situation, and it incorporates motivation. So it's rooted in expectancy theory. And it says that ultimately as a leader, we kind of need to know where our followers are at. So there were some ways to kind of diagnose the followers or the characteristics of your followers, to diagnose the task that they are being asked to do. And then you could kind of determine the best style for them perhaps. But really you're trying to motivate, you're trying to remove obstacles for them, right? And one way you can motivate is it does use a lot of extrinsic rewards. So if you remember, y'all did a case study in groups where you kind of created your own case. You talked about a time in the past and kind of looked to see whether you used the right type of leadership or not, depending on your followers and your task. What did we talk about after path goal theory? The normative decision-making model. So then Again, we built on this idea that there's more to the leadership process than just the leader. We have looked in the past at the leadership continuum that said, okay, you can be autocratic or democratic, and depending on how you are there, that's how much you're going to let people be involved in decision making. Normative decision making model comes at it from a different level, and you had all those questions. I think there were 7 or 8 questions that you answer to determine what's the quality of the decision you're trying to make and how committed do you need followers to be. And then that influenced you as a leader to figure out the type of decision-making process you needed to go through. After normative decision-making model, what did we talk about on Thursday? Teams and groups, right? How would y'all describe the biggest difference between teams and groups?
Teams are like working towards a goal that they've set together.
Yes. Teams are pretty dang committed to what they're doing because oftentimes the goal they're working towards is something they've determined themselves. Whereas with a group, they're kind of given their goal or their task to accomplish, so there's less commitment. What else differentiates groups and teams?
Who they're accountable to.
Who they're accountable to. So teams are mutually accountable to each other. In groups, they tend to be accountable to a manager or a leader. And that kind of leads to another differentiation. What does leadership look like in a group versus a team? Or who is the leader?
There's like multiple leaders on the team, and then a group is just like one leader.
Exactly. One leader for a group, multiple leaders, shared leadership in a team. Any other differences between the two? We can talk about the culture of the two, right? There's a lot of trustworthiness. And again, that idea of mutual accountability on a team. On a group, on the other hand, there tends to be a lot of conflict, oftentimes, not a lot of trustworthiness. So we've kind of started talking about all these different pieces of what makes the leadership process. We've pulled in some situation, some context. We've pulled in a little bit about follower. We've started looking at relationships more in depth. We've looked at how people work together and whether they're working together as a team or a group. Today, we're talking about this idea of followership. Before we dive into it, I want to know, what do you think of the word followership? Which do you like better? Followership or leadership? Just based off hearing the word. Maybe you don't even know what it means yet. What do you think of the word followership?
Like an individual or group of individuals that just kind of, they're like a little submissive to the I guess, leader or whatever.
Okay.
Kind of follow those roles.
So you see it as kind of, like your first connotation of it is maybe a little passive, sheep-like, a little bit? Okay. Anybody else want to take a stab or share kind of your first gut reaction to the word? By show of hands, how many of you are like, I'd rather this class be called followership theory and practice rather than leadership theory and practice? Anybody? Why do we prefer the word leadership?
Makes us feel empowered.
Makes you feel empowered. Okay, what else? What else?
I think it's well known, so the thought of something different is scary.
It's well known, and so this is just weird and different. Let's just be real, right? I was talking to someone I work with about followership theory. They had never heard about it before, and I made the case. I said, I don't think that our undergraduate programs need to be called leadership programs. I think they need to be called followership programs. And they're like, what do you mean? You know, and it was just like, and when it came down to it, they're like, I just don't like the word. And it's because we have kind of created in this way that it's the best thing to be the leader and nobody wants to be a follower, right? I'm interested to see what y'all think after we learn a little bit about followership today, to see if y'all still kind of feel that way. And so here's where followership theory has come out. It really is almost flipping leadership on its head, but this is kind of where we're at in leadership theory right now, is that, you know, because of things like LMX and team leadership, we're really starting to view leadership more as this shared process versus a process where a leader does something to their followers or motivates their followers or influences their followers. We're starting to see that maybe this is much more shared. Leaders can influence followers, but perhaps followers are influencing leaders just as much. And so we're seeing that they are interdependent. What does that word mean? If we say something's interdependent, they rely on each other. Exactly. The last bullet point here says, the world needs more followers and less glorified leaders. What is y'all's opinion on that? Because that just seems very counterintuitive to kind of what we've been taught about leadership even before this class, right? You're in high school and you're told everyone needs to become a leader, right? You're all going to be leaders. But this says the world needs more followers and less glorified leaders. Anyone agree with that statement? Why do you agree?
So I think as leaders, we need to know when it's okay to lead and when it's time to step back and let someone else do it and when to follow.
Yeah, I like that. Anybody disagree with this statement? What do you think they mean by glorified leaders?
I just think of like, so I mean, we get worried about leadership, so sometimes we need leadership roles that really don't need to be there just to say, oh, we have a leader. Like, what's the point of that role? So that's kind of
Yeah.
what I think of.
I like that. You know, we have a student organization and probably you could get the work done with 3 officers, but we like to make 8, right? So that everyone has an opportunity or what have you. And it's like, is it really needed? Is that really a leadership position? Most of the times it ends up functioning more like management, right? So it's an interesting and very different perspective on the leadership process. Again, we think back to our definition of leadership in this class. We say that leadership is a process where an individual influences a group of individuals to achieve a common goal. And so now we're really honing in on that idea of process, and we're saying it's shared. And maybe our wording is off a little bit. And so here's how we define followership. Again, it's kind of flipping that definition on its head. A process where an individual or individuals, here's a big difference, accepts the influence of others to accomplish a common goal. Where an individual or individuals accept the influence of others to accomplish a common goal. This makes me think back to LMX and that idea of a leader can constantly be trying to make relationships better with individuals. But if their followers don't want to have a high quality relationship with them, is there anything a leader can do? No. That relationship has to be something that's reciprocated. It's a two-way street, according to LMX. And so followership is kind of falling back in line with that, saying that you can want as a person all day long to influence others. But if they don't accept your influence, you haven't done jack squat, right? What do y'all think of this definition? Or let's say, which do you think is a better definition of leadership? The one we started out class with, or this one?
I think it almost gives the followers the leadership role.
Yeah. So it's weird. It's almost like we're calling it followership, but now we're starting to consider the followers the leader, and maybe the leader's really the follower. I don't know. Then we're like, are we even calling people the right thing? You know? And what do we mean by that when we say it? And so hopefully we're going to kind of get this idea of being called a follower out of our head as a bad thing. Because I think what we're going to find is that followers actually have a lot more influence when it comes to effective leadership than what we ever thought of before. And so it talks about ethical consequences. And what this means is that we're now realizing the character and the behavior of followers perhaps have more impact on organizational outcomes than what we ever thought of before. Everything before followership is looking at what is the leader doing, saying, how are they, how do they behave, and how does that affect an organization. And now we're saying, maybe it really doesn't matter who the leader is. If you've got good people in an organization, it's going to be effective regardless. So it's definitely putting more of that onus on followers. And so this theory is really starting to look at that character and the behavior of followers. Okay. Some just things, and again, you'll have these slides in Canvas, but you want to look at this idea that followership says that things are co-created. So what does that mean? If we say something's co-created, who's responsible for it? Everyone. Okay? So co-creation of influence is created by both the follower and the leader. There's not one that's more important than the other or better than the other. There's some typologies, and what I mean by this is similar to what we saw with behavior, in that we have these styles based off of task and relationship. Followership and the research that's been done with it has developed those typologies or those styles. For this class, who we're going to focus on is this dude right here, Kelly, in the 90s. So the idea of followership definitely started in the 60s, but nobody really jumped onto it. And then what happened between the 60s and the early 90s, just in history, kind of in the country and the world? What are some of the historical things that went on? What can you think of? Big key moments in our history between the 60s and the 90s.
Cold War.
The Cold War.
Civil rights.
Civil rights movement. Nixon. JFK. There's so many things, right, that just kind of upheaved what we thought of as effective leadership. And that's really then all of a sudden researchers were starting to say, okay, maybe we've been kind of going down this different path. And maybe really it's not about the person who's in charge, it's about followers. It's about the people that make up an organization or a group or a business. And so Zalesnik's idea of followership, again, kind of teetered out a little bit during that time, but then in the early 90s, it got picked up again. And Kelly was one of the guys that said, hey, I think we need to start looking into this a little bit more. And so we're going to focus specifically on how he types, or the styles he developed for followers.
So for the test, do we need to know all of them and what theirs are, or do you just want us to mainly focus on Kelly?
Focus on Kelly. I'm just kind of giving y'all the context to kind of understand where we came from.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and it's interesting, there have been some people since then that have, as you can see, developed their own typologies. Everybody goes back to Kelly, because really it's they just kind of slapped a new name on it, per se. So everything refers back to Kelly. That's where we're going to start with. Okay, so here's what Kelly said. He sees that followers are valuable to organizations. He looks at motivations of exemplary followers. So again, we have this idea that maybe it's not just about traits or behavior. Maybe we've got to look a little bit at people's motivation and why they do the things that they do. So again, y'all can see why it was so important for us to spend some time on motivation. But instead of determining these follower styles based off of task and relationship, he bases it off of two axes. The first one has to do with critical thinking and kind of the level of a person's critical thinking. Does this follower, are they considered an independent critical thinker? Or are they a dependent uncritical thinker? Describe to me what someone would look like who's an independent critical thinker.
Like an engineer.
How so?
When I think of an engineer major, this is exactly what I think of.
Yeah.
Someone who needs to work on their own and solve a problem by themselves.
Yeah. Don't necessarily have to be told what to do step by step. They problem solve, and even when they hit a roadblock, they then figure out what to do without like constantly going back to somebody else, right? And again, that critical thinking is that they're willing to think outside of the box. Again, they're looking at all the different options, things that are available. What's a dependent, uncritical thinker look like? Any of y'all ever worked with someone that it was like, it didn't matter if they did things 10 times, they were constantly going to ask how to do something? And you're like, haven't you picked up on the program here, the pattern, right? Like they just, sometimes there's a little bit, again, you think of that like external locus of control. They perhaps lack a little bit of confidence in making their own decisions. And so because of that, they tend to ask. And it's not that asking a lot of questions is bad, but they don't just do on their own, right? They're also that employee that like if you give them a list to do, they'll probably do the list you give them. But are they going to do more? No, because you didn't tell them to do it. They're dependent on the person that they work for. And then uncritical thinking is this idea of, again, just not thinking outside the box. Like maybe they tend to use the phrase, well, this is how it's always been done, right? I don't want to really sit down and brainstorm new ways to do things. So that's the first axis that we look at in followers, is that we want to kind of figure out, where do people lie on this spectrum? Are they independent critical thinkers or dependent uncritical thinkers? And then we look at behavior. And so the specific behavior that we're looking at for followers is whether they're active or passive. What do you think we mean by someone being an active follower or showing active behavior in an organization?
Someone who does the extra work without being asked.
They do the extra work without being asked. They show up. They're engaged in what's going on. They're having conversations. Passive is definitely that idea of like they come to work, they do their job, they're out, right? Like no real commitment or investment into the organization or the group. Let's figure out what your follower style is before we look at the specifics of the 5 types. So rather than handing y'all out an assessment, we're going to kind of do this assessment together as a class. Take out a blank sheet of paper. And on that sheet of paper, I would like for you to number it 1 through 20. Before we answer the first question, I want you to think about yourself in a situation where you are the follower. Maybe you are part of a club or an organization where you're not an officer, you're just a member, okay? You can be a follower in a class. As a student, if you see a teacher as the leader, as a student, you might be a follower. It could be a job that you have. If you're not the manager, you're the follower, right? So think of that context and use that context to help you answer these questions. All of them you're going to answer on a scale of 0 to 6. If you answer 6, this means almost always. If you have answer 0, it means rarely. You could be somewhere in between. You kind of gauge where you are on this. So question 1, does your work help you fulfill some societal goal or personal dream that's important to you? Almost always, answer 6. If it rarely does, 0. 3 would be occasionally. You might be somewhere else in between. 2, and again, go with your gut reaction. Are your personal work goals aligned with the organization's priority goals? And if I go too fast, y'all tell me. 3, are you highly committed to and energized by your work and organization, giving them your best ideas and performance? 4, does your enthusiasm also spread to and energize your coworkers? 5, instead of waiting for or merely accepting what the leader tells you, do you personally identify which activities are most critical for achieving the organization's priority goals? 6, do you actively develop a distinctive competence in those critical activities so that you become more valuable to the leader in the organization? 7, when starting a new job or assignment, do you promptly build a record of successes and tasks that are important to the leader? 8, can the leader give you a difficult assignment without the benefit of much supervision, knowing that you will meet your deadline with highest quality work and that you will fill the cracks if need be? 9, do you take the initiative to seek out and successfully complete assignments that go above and beyond your job? 10, when you are not the leader of a group project, do you still contribute at a high level, often doing more than your share? 11, do you independently think up and champion new ideas that will contribute significantly to the leader's or the organization's goals? 12, do you try to solve the tough problems rather than look to the leader to do it for you? 13, do you help out other coworkers, making them look good even when you don't get any credit? 14, do you help the leader or group see both the upside potential and downside risks of ideas or plans, playing the devil's advocate if need be? 15, do you understand the leader's needs, goals, and constraints and work hard to help meet them? 16, do you actively and honestly own up to your strengths and weaknesses rather than put off evaluation? 17, do you make a habit of internally questioning the wisdom of the leader's decision rather than just doing what you are told? 18, when the leader asks you to do something that runs contrary to your professional or personal preferences, do you say no rather than yes? 19, do you act on your own ethical standards rather than the leader's or the group's standards? And 20, Do you assert your views on important issues, even though it might mean conflict with your group or reprisals from the leader? All right. Anybody need any question to be repeated? Okay. So here's how to score. First, you're going to figure out your independent thinking score. So you're going to take those questions, 1, 5, 11, 12, 14, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, add up and get a total score for that. And then you're going to find out your engagement score. So the rest of the questions, you'll sum those up and get a score. I should have warned y'all you were doing math today. All right, looks like everybody's finishing up adding. So I am going to kind of help you decipher your results. And so the first thing, if for both axes, so engagement as well as your thinking score, if on both of those you scored below 20, I want you to write down passive. That would be your follower style, okay? If you scored from 20 to 40 on both of those, okay, so if you're between 20 and 40 on both, write down pragmatist. That would be your follower style. Okay. If you scored below 20 on thinking, but scored above 40 on engagement, write down conformist. If you scored above 40 on thinking, but below 20 on engagement, write down alienated. And then if you scored above 40 on both, write down exemplary. Huh?
39 and 42.
39 is lower than 40. So which one did you have?
I don't remember.
39, I'm assuming that that would be your thinking
Yes.
score? Okay. So you're in, and then, so you don't have between those two.
I'm sorry, I'm complicated.
No, you're not. And then what was your 42? So you scored high on engagement. Write down conformist / pragmatist. Like that's, you're probably in that, you'll see on the thing, you're probably in that corner right there. Anybody else need help deciphering your results? Yes, ma'am. Okay, so your engagement is high. So you were probably, write down conformist / pragmatist. You're kind of like right in between those two. All right, everybody got your follower cell. One more.
Mine's in the middle, I think, also.
Okay.
I have 34 on independent and then 47.
So write down conformist / pragmatist. Probably where you're at. All right, so let's take a look here. You're going to kind of recognize this grid. It's a little bit similar to the leadership grid that we saw. Again, just the difference is the things that we're putting on the axes, right? So instead of task and relationship behavior, for followers, we're looking at the y-axis is going to be that thinking. The x-axis is going to be engagement.